Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, HIPAA Compliance Made Easy, presented by Evan Burke of Certus Technologies. Please be aware that there will be a question-answer portion today at the end of the webinar. To avoid frequent interruptions during the webinar, please type your questions in the question box located on the right of your screen. They will be answered in the order which they are received during that question-answer portion. Additionally, an electronic version of this presentation will be emailed to all participants following completion of today's webinar. Again, NJMGMA would like to thank you for attending, and I will now turn things over to Evan.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar entitled HIPAA Compliance Made Easy. Now, the fact is that achieving HIPAA compliance is not an easy task, but it can be made easier by first, demystifying and understanding the laws and rules, and second, by following a proven approach. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to take a quick look at a HIPAA overview and timeline, and then dive into the two key HIPAA elements, which are the privacy and the security rules. You need to understand these if you're going to become HIPAA compliant. We'll spend some time on the risk analysis and help you clearly understand what it is, what you need, why I should say you need to do it, and how it's done. And from there, we'll talk about technology that's available to make HIPAA compliance much easier. My name is Evan Burke, and I'm the managing partner at Certus Technologies. We're a managed and cloud services IT firm that focuses on helping our clients to improve their operations and profitability and to achieve regulatory compliance. But the title I like the best is Chief Demystifier. I say this because we in the IT industry tend to make things way more complicated than they really need to be. And my job is to simplify and demystify. And that's what I'm going to hopefully do for you today. I'll start with our obligatory disclaimer that keep in mind, while our objective is to help demystify HIPAA and to help you become compliant, this is not a HIPAA training session. It's really just a start, and there's a lot we won't be able to touch on. That said, you should feel comfortable after this presentation that you understand the core constructs of the law and can begin taking action to achieve compliance. One other note, if you are a covered entity, I recommend reaching out to consultants and attorneys, professionals to help you as you get your HIPAA house in order. So let's start with the HIPAA overview. And we'll start with the fact that we all hate definitions. But we need to understand them anyway to make sure we clearly can get started down the path of HIPAA compliance. So I will breeze through a bunch of this on the assumption that the majority of you are in fact already well aware of these terms, and so be patient for those that maybe aren't as well aware. First, covered entity. That's you, the healthcare provider. Second, business associate. Now, a business associate is a person other than the provider of healthcare, and that includes folks like me as an IT provider. It includes all sorts of other folks, including attorneys, accountants, pretty much anyone that you work with or that works with and for you, then that might be exposed to protected health information. Thought I'd throw up here a slide by HIPAA by the numbers. And there's some interesting numbers on here that I want to focus on. The ones that interest me the most are the fact that on the black market, interestingly enough, it's a 50-to-1 ratio between the value the black market places on medical records compared to the value that's placed for a credit card record, which just goes to show the importance of keeping health information private. When you think about the fact that someone's willing to pay $50 on the black market for a medical record as opposed to $1 for a credit card, that's an astounding thing. The other thing I want to kind of bring focus on here is the huge percentage of mobile devices, whether it's cell phones or tablets or whatever, mobile devices that are not encrypting data, and many of which have protected health information on them. And this is something we're going to come back to, but interesting numbers for sure. So let's talk about protected health information. While most of you already know this, I believe it's a good way to start with a clear definition of what PHI is. And so we start by saying protected health information is identifiable health information. Identifiable meaning it can be linked to a particular person. If it can be traced back to an individual, and by the way, that's easier than you think it is, as you'll see on the next slide, then that becomes protected. Protected health information talks about past, present, or future health delivery, whether it's physical or mental. It talks about payment. So basically, when it comes to anything that you or we might deliver to a patient, or any payment related to that delivery, it's protected health information. Electronic protected health information, or ePHI, is simply protected health information in an electronic form. Think your EHR, EMR system. And the important thing to note here is that this includes not just the records within your system, but everything: words, images, voice files, dictation, everything on any media. And sometimes this is overlooked when you're considering what you need to protect. So what are identifiers? Identifiers are those things that help allow the medical information to be tracked back to the actual individual, and it's easier than you think. So obviously things like social security numbers and street addresses are easy identifiers, but you have to be careful here, because in truth, medical record numbers, diagnosis and treatment codes, information like that can also allow it to be linked back to the patient. And anything that can link a record back to a patient causes that record to be considered protected health information. PHI is everywhere, and it crops up in some interesting places, so you need to be careful when you start to think about this. Even copiers and scanners, by the way, can contain electronic PHI, as they often will store pages in memory. And if you've ever gone, to some more of the recent copiers and or scanners and run something through and walked away with the original document in hand, that does not mean that the image is gone. It may well still be in memory, and it's something to be considered. You really need to consider every possible source when looking at PHI. So myths and facts. Myth number one, HIPAA is about compliance. Well, that's not true. HIPAA is about preventing data breaches. That's what HIPAA is all about: privacy and data breaches. Myth number two, that a risk analysis, which we're going to get into in a bit later, that a risk analysis is optional for small providers, and that also is not true. Regardless of the size of your practice, you must perform a risk analysis, and you must mitigate those risks and achieve compliance. That's regardless of the size of the practice. Now, it's easier for smaller practices because they have less to look at, but it still has to be done. One of the biggest myths is the idea that, well, we put in an EHR and EMR system, so it's certified, we're compliant. Well, that's not true. You still must perform a full security risk analysis and look at all PHI, not just what's in your electronic system. So let's talk about an act as opposed to a rule. The HIPAA Act means it's a law. So an act is a law, and the rules that enforce that law are supported by the enforcing agency, and we'll come back to that in a bit. I'm not going to spend time here other than to say the important thing to understand is we see the word act, but translate that into the word law. This is not a choice. The HITECH Act redefined or expanded, I should say, the HIPAA Act, or so let's say the high-tech law expanded the HIPAA law, and in so doing, it funded a number of things. It funded the federal subsidy that many of you use to actually implement your EHR systems. But it also made sure that business associates have to comply the same way that you do. And further, and this is interesting, it defined the data breach rule. And that data breach rule has a very important addition to it, and that is that if data is encrypted, its loss is not reportable. And we're going to come back to that, but that's a very important rule to help you avoid exposure. So we've talked about acts. Now let's talk about rules. Rules are how the acts are implemented, how they're enforced. So in this case, the omnibus rule clarified a number of things, but most importantly, it established clear definitions of patient rights to their own health records, and also required that business associates have an agreement in place with you, the covered entities. So who enforces all of this? Well, we start with the Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights. So the OCR, which by the way is very aggressive now about enforcing these rules, is first and foremost in terms of enforcement, but most states also have data breach laws. So it's not enough just to meet the federal code. You also have to consider the state in which you work and the state in which your practices reside, because, for instance, states like California have actually more difficult reporting rules than HIPAA itself, than the OCR would enforce. So you have to know the state rules as well as the federal rules. And there are a number of agencies that, by the way, can create enforcement issues, not just the OCR, and I list them here. So let's talk about the Office of Civil Rights. I mentioned that they're being very aggressive. I'm going to go ahead and click here on what's called the Hall of Shame. I don't know if any of you have ever spent any time and taken a look out and seen what this looks like, but this is the OCR's Hall of Shame website. And as you can see on this website, it's listing, starting back in 2009, it's listing all of those breaches that have been reported, whether small or large. It's listing those breaches, and you can, from which, by the way, you can drill down and get further information. So I'm going to go over here and change the sort order. Let's bring up the most recent breaches. It takes a second for the website to respond. There we go. So we're seeing as of 12/28, Michael Benjamin, MD, suffered a breach as a result of a problem with, in this case, paper or film, you see on the far right there, and 1,300 individuals were affected. Now, everybody and anybody that reports a breach is going to find their way onto this website. So obviously we want to make sure we get our HIPAA house cleaned up and in order before a breach, before an audit, if you want to avoid major fines. I'm not going to read this. By the way, as Dawn mentioned, you'll be getting these slides, so you can read this at your leisure. But understand that if you suffer a breach, you're probably going to wind up paying between $10,000 and upwards of $1.5 million, depending on the situation, the number of records breached, whether you properly reported it, and whether you fall under the banner of willful neglect. So let's look at some examples. Concentra got hit with a huge fine, even though they only breached the records of 870 individuals. Why? Because they were found to have so many unencrypted laptops that contained EPHI, and they should have known better. Think willful neglect. The message: if you have electronic protected health information of any kind on laptops, you really need to think about encryption as a requirement, not as an option. This dermatology group was fined after breaching the records of 2,200 patients because of all things, a stolen thumb drive. Messages that I take away, and you should as well. First, they didn't conduct a full risk analysis. They had a breach, and that really hurt them. And second, you really need to report breaches. They did not properly report this breach, and it came back to haunt them. The cancer care group, this oncology practice, had huge willful neglect. They not only, in this case, they left a backup disk and a laptop in an employee's car, and it was stolen. And it was not encrypted. So in this case, they also did not perform a risk analysis. And the bottom line is, and I urge you to think about this in context of your own practices, how many of you out there are in the same position where maybe you're taking a USB drive or some other kind of disk drive that you're using for backup home or someplace, a bank, wherever, stop at 7-Eleven and leave it in your car? Is it encrypted? If it isn't, you're putting yourself at great risk. Something to think about. So let's talk about willful neglect and how it's defined. There are basically two areas of willful neglect. One, the conscious intentional failure to protect information. That makes sense, obviously, if we willfully, intentionally go out of our way to breach information, that should be willful neglect. But the second part of this, and the one that's really important, is indifference. If we just plain don't pay attention to the obligation to comply with HIPAA, that is considered willful neglect. The penalties will be significant if you have a breach and you have not gone through the process of complying or attempting to comply with HIPAA. We talked about some of those fines. But the good news here is that you can actually avoid most, and some and sometimes all penalties if you actually go through the process of HIPAA compliance and avoid the term willful neglect. So we understand the penalties involved. Let's focus on the rules with which we must comply. First is the privacy rule. This is the starting point for HIPAA compliance. And it basically sets the expectation that personal medical records must be protected and kept private, and that they may not be disclosed to anyone without patient authorization. Makes sense. And by the way, that website that I put here has more information, and when you receive the presentation, the slides, you'll be able to click through to that website if you'd like to get more. So the privacy rule, which says things have to be kept private and not released without authorization, needs to be complied with by you, the covered entities, by anyone that pays insurance companies, and by the way, that includes self-insured businesses. So those businesses that self-insure for medical, they are payers and they must comply as well. And finally, business associates. You need to pay attention to these business associates, and I'll come back to that in greater detail. Who doesn't have to comply with the privacy rules? Well, that basically includes companies that transport PHI but otherwise can't see it. So those that transport it, and I put on here the Postal Service, FedEx, UPS, they're not accessing, they can't see that protected health information, so they are actually excluded. They do not have to comply with HIPAA. Similarly and interestingly, internet service providers like Optimum or Comcast or whoever you use for internet, they also don't need to have a business associate agreement. Okay, we've talked about the privacy rule and that it establishes that we must protect and keep those personal medical records private. The security rule tells us how we must then do this. It operationalizes the privacy rule. It tells us the key safeguards that we need to have in place. Again, this makes sense. All right, these safeguards, by the way, and we're going to drill into this in a little bit more detail, come into three ways: administrative, physical, and technical. The language of the security rule is very specific, and there are certain terms that you need to be comfortable with and remember. First, confidentiality. Well, that's pretty obvious. It means that the EPHI is not available and it cannot be disclosed to unauthorized persons. Integrity. This is important to HIPAA as well. It means that the protected health information cannot and must not be altered or destroyed in an unauthorized manner. And finally, availability. This means that the PHI is accessible and usable as needed on demand by authorized persons. So it's not enough just to keep things confidential. They must be kept not only confidential, but they must be kept whole, and they must be made available on demand as needed. By the way, this rule applies to all covered entities, from the smallest providers to the largest multi-state health plans. So the security rule is really designed to be flexible and scalable and allow you, the covered entity, to analyze your own needs and implement the security rule based on your specific environment. What's appropriate for one will not be appropriate for the other. This is where things get really sticky. And that's because most small and, for that matter, some mid-sized practices just don't have the IT knowledge required to meet the security rule safeguards. We'll drill down in a few minutes into what those safeguards look like. But before that, let's talk about the data breach rule. This rule is actually pretty simple. If any one of us, whether a covered entity or a business associate, knows or learns of a PHI breach of any size, even theoretically a single record, we must report it to the affected individual, the patient whose record was breached, and to the HHS. If there are over 500 individuals affected, then we must also report it to the media, and this is not an option. All right. If you ever have a breach and choose to ignore it, and it becomes known later, there's going to be some serious pain. The good news is that if someone steals a garbage bag full of shredded paper records, it's not considered a breach. Similarly, if you have a protected, properly encrypted hard drive, or maybe other backup device, and it's lost or stolen, whether it's a laptop or backup, whatever, if it's encrypted properly, it's also not a breach. So the bottom line is, if you take the diligence and care to ensure that your PHI is not readable, you'll be okay. The one gotcha, though, is you must be able to provide evidence that a lost or stolen device was encrypted. It's not enough for us to say it was. We have to prove that it was. And so records have to be kept, detailed records that show what was encrypted, using what tool, when, and where. So we understand the privacy rule, we get the security rule overall, we understand the data breach rule. How do we then go about becoming truly HIPAA compliant? The first step is a risk analysis. And the risk analysis basically is a requirement. It's not an option. Regardless of the size of your practice, I urge you to begin this process. What we learn during the process will then drive what needs to be done afterward, and it will be different for each practice. Some practices will have a lot of things that need to be remediated, some only a little. Also, the risk analysis is not a one and done situation. It needs to be revisited when things change in your practice. What could change? Well, pretty much anything that affects privacy and security. Maybe you're adding electronic door locks or badges, or maybe you're adding or replacing IT equipment. Whatever, if things change, you need to regularly and proactively address this and perform what amounts to a follow-up analysis. Furthermore, you really need to constantly be looking at the logs that your systems are tracking of who has accessed electronic PHI to make sure that no one's getting access that shouldn't be getting access. It's not enough just to have the logs. You have to periodically evaluate them. So what's involved in a risk analysis? What do we really need to do? Well, everything must be looked at. Servers, workstations, laptops, firewalls, your wireless networks and the access points that support them, switches, smartphones, tablets, email, application software, not just your EHR or EMR system, but all application software and their underlying databases. You need to consider everywhere that electronic PHI might be stored, including, by the way, thumb drives. I mean, I don't know how many of you maybe back up your QuickBooks data onto a thumb drive and take it home with you in your pocket or purse, and that backup is, again, unprotected. That has to be looked at. Email systems, and by the way, systems like Dropbox or any other cloud server. Once we do that, then we need to look at all the routes in, within, and out of your organization that data flows. We have to look at that to identify what security is in place and to make sure if it's not in place that we can then remediate the problem and put it in place. Now, some small practices might be able to do this kind of risk analysis by themselves, but most are going to choose to work with an experienced outside consultant, especially with some of the IT components. And don't forget, you need to consider the PHI stored not only in your EHR database, but also what's called unstructured data. Data like letters to insurance companies, spreadsheets, any kind of documents that might be sitting on your servers and, I hate to say it worse, on your local workstations. What we have learned is that almost every practice we go into says we do not keep electronic PHI stored locally. And almost every single one, in fact, doesn't even realize that that is the case, that that PHI is being stored locally. And that's the kind of thing that a risk analysis will help assess. Okay, we've identified now the systems and the data, the ins and the outs. We need now to focus on the vulnerabilities and the threats. Are your systems vulnerable? The question here is what might happen as a result of how and where PHI is stored. So vulnerabilities, and I put a few here just so that you start to think about it. It's interesting. It's not enough to just have antivirus software. You need to make sure that your signatures are recent and are constantly being updated. But there are all sorts of vulnerabilities, by the way, including maybe an internet failure or a power grid problem or untrained users and so on and so forth. So once we've looked at the vulnerabilities together, then you need to look at the threats. And the threats are obviously two basic areas. One are natural threats, think hurricane, tornado, fire, flood, that kind of thing, but also man-made threats. What happens if equipment fails or someone tries to steal something? Once we've looked at that, we now must assess what's called the likelihood that a threat might actually occur, and then determine the potential impact of that threat. And by the way, when we talk about impact, it's not just on patient care, which, by the way, might be a life or death situation, so I'm not minimizing that. But it's also the impact on your practice financially, on your reputation, on our careers. So those impacts are significant, and we need to think about them. So impact really is the key word. And If the impact or potential impact is high, you must, under the HIPAA rules, plan for it. Even if it's unlikely, and I'll use as an example here, we identify that a practice has a vulnerability. A fire could cause a total loss of infrastructure because they don't have an effective off-site backup. What's the likelihood? Well, that's pretty low, but the impact is huge. The potential loss of all EPH of patient records is enormous and goes to the core of what HIPAA is about. So we need to now look at this and decide together how we're going to plan for off-site backup and formal disaster recovery. That's the kind of impact that even an unlikely situation could require in terms of having us address it. Okay, we've looked at the big picture now. Let's start to drill into the 3 safeguards that the security rule requires that you and we look at as we implement and remediate and achieve HIPAA compliance. And there are 3: administrative, physical, and technical. Administrative, let's start there. First, you have to have a security or compliance official. Larger firms are going to have 2. They're going to have a security official and possibly a separate privacy official. Smaller organizations may have 1. There is no rule that you have to have more than 1. That's up to you. But regardless, this person is going to be a critical part of your compliance initiatives. This compliance contact needs to be well trained. They will be your point of contact for outside consultants and legal counsel, and they are going to be your central point of contact for everything you do compliance-wise. So you need to choose this person carefully. Next, workforce training. This is, again, not an option. You need to pay close attention to the training given to staff members that access electronic PHI. And you must not forget temps and subcontractors. Ignorance here is no excuse. You need to be sure to document who was trained, when they were trained, and what training they were given. And you need to have a sanctions policy. It's not, by the way, enough just to have a policy. You need to apply that policy when a workforce member breaks the rules. And finally, we need to rinse and repeat. It's not enough to train once. We have to continuously be doing this, documenting it, and being in a position to withstand an audit that says, prove that you trained your people. Continuing down the road of administrative safeguards, you now then need to establish policies and procedures for access to electronic protected health information. So the important thing here is to remember that in general, access must be restricted overall and then only granted to those whose role requires it. But we need to go further. We need to document and make sure we're clear on who establishes access within your organization, who can modify that access within your organization, what is the process, and again, documentation. Also under the heading of administrative safeguards are login monitoring, antivirus and malware protection software, password management. And by the way, as I mentioned before, it's not enough to simply have antivirus software installed. It's got to be kept current. So you need to have documented these policies and procedures. You need to document when and how often virus definitions are updated. You need to document what is going to be your response when a virus outbreak occurs. You need to train your staff on these policies. And you need to make sure that you have a formal security incident procedure in place. This is a written set of forms, if you will. So if there is a problem, you're able to clearly document it. By the way, on the heading of passwords, Safeguards include things like how many unsuccessful logins can be attempted before a user is locked out. And by the way, are they even being logged and monitored as to who's logging in and what they're doing? What about length, password length, and strength? And worst of all, the policy about not writing down or sharing passwords. Also under administrative safeguards are policies and procedures for dealing with emergencies. These have to be in writing. They might be small emergencies, maybe a server goes down and needs to be, fixed or replaced, but they might be large emergencies like prolonged power outages or a fire or whatever. Data backup and recovery policies have to be included here. And we need to remember to include a policy, by the way, on where the disaster recovery plan is even being stored so you can get to it in the event of an emergency. A note on business continuity. Business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans go really hand in hand, but IT firms often take on the responsibility of the DR side, but don't do much in the way of business continuity. And you really need to include both sides of these plans in your HIPAA compliance. Oh, and last but not least, we need to make sure that all business associates have agreements in place. Okay, onward to physical safeguards. We've talked about administrative safeguards. Let's talk about physical safeguards, and these are pretty straightforward. These policies specify who is and isn't allowed physical access to your facilities and equipment. This could include a policy on guests entering your premises, what staff members might have access to server rooms, maybe even who's authorized to get into providers' offices. And once you have the policies, your procedures will describe how you enforce them and would include detailed discussion of how you might make use of security badges and key codes and access logs and things like that. You need to establish physical safeguards regarding media controls. You have to define in writing what are your policies when it comes to destruction and disposal, reuse, who's accountable, who has what assets, and not the least of it is making sure that data backup and storage is also accounted for. Finally, there are technical safeguards. Here's where you document the IT systems you have in place that limit access to EPHI. You must touch on the policies of unique user IDs, of forced log-offs after a period of inactivity, and of the encryption of data. By the way, I mentioned unique user IDs. Many practices really hate this. They don't want to adopt this rule because it means that every user, every person, staff member, as they move around within the practice, has to log off and then log back on your EHR system. The result is that many practices, and I'm sure a few of you out there, have shared IDs. And be aware that this goes against the core of HIPAA compliance. It prevents effective logging and tracking of who's doing what, and you must fix this, even if it causes aggravation to you and your users. This is not an option. One final word on administrative logins. I mentioned here on the bottom, system admin versus sub-accounts. So your IT firm probably has access to the system admin login. That's kind of a problem. It's not kind of a problem, it is a problem. Your IT firm should not be logging in and doing work under the system administrator level. Instead, you should be working with them to establish a sub-account that maybe has the same rights, but is separately trackable so you know, and that is so that it is auditable when they go in and do something as opposed to when you go in as a system admin and do something. High risks that occur. What kind of risks do we find? It's a long list. I've put a couple of screens here. You can come back and read them at your leisure, but that's the point. The whole point of a risk analysis is to identify the risks so we can address them and fix them. Here's a few more risks that need to be considered and that are often found. So we've gone through the initial process of risk analysis. We've looked at and identified what we think are the problems. We now need to remediate them. And remediation comes in there are two terms, I should say, that affect remediation, and I want to make sure you're comfortable with them. Required versus addressable. So required is just that. You don't have a choice. You have to implement required specifications. Addressable, however, is where many of you will get into an area where you make an assumption that's not true. Addressable is not optional. Addressable means that if it's reasonable and appropriate for your particular covered entity, you better do it. If it's not reasonable or appropriate, then it allows you to specify an alternative approach, an alternative measure that achieves the same purpose. And you have to document this. So I use this as an example. Maybe for some reason in your practice, automatic log off of workstations cannot be enforced. Well, if that's the case for some reason in your world, then the alternative is to never leave the patients in a room with an unlocked computer. In essence, we're saying the alternative is that our workforce, before they leave any room and walk away from any computer, will lock that machine. That is considered an acceptable, if you will, alternative, but it does, of course, put the onus on you and your workforce. And as long as you document it, then this is an addressable requirement for which you've come up with an alternative. Keep in mind, there are big fines if you don't implement all of it. Okay. Now let's talk about, very briefly, policies. They go to the what and the why. You need to create policies. Policies are pretty simple. They don't change, or they rarely change. They talk to the idea of here's our policy, here's the way we believe we're going to run our practice. And in this case, I wrote down here an example. An individual's authorization to use or disclose protected health information in accordance with HIPAA regulation, blah, blah, blah. That's the policy. There are a lot of policies that you need to consider. Procedures go to the detail, the how, the where, the when. Procedures change regularly, and procedures are much more detailed. This is the beginning of a procedure on authorization, and basically it defines how we implement the policy. There are a lot of procedures as well, and these procedures, incidentally, are going to not just change, but you can also use some templates that are purchasable out there to get you started. Look at them carefully, however, and remember, you have to customize them. It's not enough to simply slap your organization's name on a bunch of purchase procedures and expect to, become HIPAA compliant. I've talked about the need for BAAs, business associate agreements. This is not an option. You have to do it. You have to make sure your business associates are, in fact, all under agreement with you, and that their subcontractors all have agreements in place. That's your job. That's our job. So ask questions. Let's talk about technology. I think about the Ronco infomercials I used to see years ago on late night TV, and I like the term set it and forget it. Of course, you really can't do this, but there's technology that can make things much, much easier. The first one is Active Directory. You may have heard the term. We in the IT business tend to make this very complicated. It really isn't. Active Directory runs on a server and allows you and us to centrally define your users, their groups, their roles, and their rights. So, Active Directory defines who can log in. It defines what can they get at to, what can they access when they do log in. And it defines what are called group policies. And group policies are the real benefit of Active Directory, because group policies are automatically deployed. The users have no choice. So things like password complexity, how long before workstations are forced to sign off, how many login attempts before locking, these are all part of the policies that Active Directory enforce automatically and cannot be changed by users. So Active Directory is a huge help in getting things to be automated and getting closer to the concept of set it and forget it. A couple other things about Active Directory. It can prevent unidentified user access to the network. So if I walk into one of your practices and I can plug my laptop into your network and get access, well, that's a problem. And Active Directory can help you prevent that. It also automates the logging so that you can support an audit. And by the way, is available both in an on-premise server and for those of you who are working out of a cloud-based environment in cloud computing as well. I'm not going to spend any time on secure email. That's something that's coming up in another month or two. But suffice it to say, you have to have secure encrypted email if you're transmitting or possibly transmitting protected health information. Backup, compliant or encrypted backup. There are lots of services that offer this, but they aren't all HIPAA compliant, so you need to ask questions. Make sure your IT firm is dealing with a HIPAA compliant encrypted cloud backup provider, and make sure that the data is being uploaded and stored both ways is being encrypted. You got to make sure that that service is, in fact, has a BAA agreement, and you need to make sure that online services, think Dropbox, are also HIPAA compliant. They aren't all HIPAA compliant. A number of them need third-party plugins to make them HIPAA compliant. Don't make any assumptions. I want to talk for a second about IT managed service providers. The question really is, do you need one? Should you engage one? And these are the things you need to be thinking about as you make this decision. For some of you, in fact, you have the skills, both in-house or your existing IT firm may have the skills to be able to do the things you need to do. But regardless, you need to consider all the elements of the security rule when deciding whether you want to bring on an outside provider. For whatever it's worth, an effective managed provider will be very proactive, will define and identify problems before they occur, will deliver professional skills that most covered entities just don't have. They'll allow you to focus on your practice instead of on IT, and they will allow you to become, or they will support your HIPAA compliance initiatives. By the way, and I know I'm biased, but I can tell you that every practice to whom we provide our services wonders how they managed before we got involved. That to me is the standard by which an IT firm should be measured. So, what about cloud? This is also a very broad and deep area, something I'm not going to be able to get into detail on, but I want to go to the side of it in terms of whether or not cloud and how cloud computing can simplify HIPAA compliance. Here you go. First, cloud computing will help you to establish restricted physical access to the servers on which your data reside. That's an important part of the security rule. The idea that people can't go in and steal a disk drive out of those servers or can't physically access those servers, well, they can't because they're in a data center. Second, cloud computing should include an encrypted backup of your PHI and make sure that the routines are being monitored and managed every single day. They dramatically simplify disaster recovery planning, reduce downtime, Force the review of some of your existing systems. Moving to the cloud will force the review of some of your existing and possibly unsecure systems. And of course, they'll ensure that as a result of encryption that breaches can't occur, and they provide redundancy, think multiple layers of equipment, so that there is never a loss suffered of PHI. The big question, of course, is cloud computing secure? And the answer is yes, provided that it's a highly available infrastructure, meaning that the cloud provider has layer upon layer, multiple servers, multiple firewalls, multiple switches, and so on and so forth, so that if any one component fails, it automatically fails over to a second level and causes no downtime. And obviously it needs to utilize advanced technology to provide a secure, what's called a VPN or virtual private network environment. It needs to include Active Directory, and it has to be monitored by experienced folks 24/7. As to whether cloud computing will pay for itself, that's something that's a lot more complicated to answer. It really goes to a bunch of these questions. Do you have multiple offices? How are your servers performing? Are those remote offices working well with your EHR, or is it performing properly? Is it performing poorly? Do you own an old license to your EHR software running on your server, or is it already a cloud app that's running out of a data center provided by the EHR vendor? The big one, and the one that often brings, I'm going to say, the dollars and cents into the equation is, are you maintaining a number of dedicated IT staffers and the cost for those beyond that which may be necessary? And cloud computing has a tendency to disrupt that and reduce that cost. I'm going to put these questions up. I'm not going to spend any time here, but I urge you to ask your IT firms these questions, because if they can't answer them properly, then you should be wary of whether or not you're dealing with the right IT firm. So, in summary, what do we need to do to make HIPAA compliance, if not easy, easier? First, as I hope I've helped you do, understand the privacy and the security rules. Second, perform the risk analysis we've talked about. Identify the vulnerabilities and threats, administrative, physical, and technical. Assess those vulnerabilities and threats, the impact of them, prioritize what needs to be done and remediated first, second, third, and so forth, and then document it as you remediate it. Train your workforce members. Document everything you do. Develop and implement written policies and procedures. This will take some time. Don't worry about it. Let it take that time, but go through the process. And most important, if you ever have a breach, report it. So that's the presentation for today. I would welcome any questions, and those that I'm not able to answer, I'm happy to get back to you afterwards with specific answers.
Okay, so I'm going to get to the questions in the order that I received them. So if you have any questions, please get them over to me as quickly as possible. Evan, the first question, what if a personnel cell phone that requires a PIN for entry is lost or stolen? Would this be a breach? PHI can be assessed through the phone.
If the phone, well, the question becomes whether or not that PIN is secure enough to prevent access. There's a difference between a PIN for access and encryption for access. And so the short answer is it might be enough to prevent a breach if it can't be accessed, and if that phone is set in such a way that you are able to do what's called brick it, or in essence, when that phone gets turned on and connected to the network, that you're in a position to press the button or have your IT firm press the button and destroy the information on it. Generally speaking, I don't think the personal opinion is, I don't think the 4-digit PIN is enough, and I wouldn't count on that in being in a position to prevent a breach.
Okay. Should a CE have a BAA with their landlord? We just recently had an incident where the landlord accessed the premises to make repairs without our knowledge. There is no HIPAA agreement in place.
Wow, that's a good question. I've never been asked that one before. I don't know the answer to that one. That's one that we probably should direct to an attorney. My instinct would be, as long as you keep your files locked and your systems locked the way they're supposed to be from a privacy standpoint, then even if the landlord gets physical access to your plant, they wouldn't have access to protected health information. The question, though, is a good one, and we're going to need to direct that to an attorney.
Okay, folks, if there's no other questions today, I'm going to end the webinar, but please remember you do have Evan's contact information, so if there are questions that you'd like to take offline, please contact him directly. Again, I will be emailing out the presentation later today so that you can all have it. Thank you again for attending, and we look forward to having you again in the future.